Welcome everybody. In this video, we are going to talk about for loops. And in Python, a for loop is a loop that iterates over a list or a collection of objects. So in order to understand how for loops work, we're going to have to create a list and then we're going to do a little bit of work with it. And I just want to point out before we get started that I have created a new Python file for this particular video. So if you need to do that, right click on your project folder that says sandbox here, go to new, go to Python file, and then type in the name of your Python file. Make sure you give it a .py extension, hit enter, and it'll open up like I've got here. I'm calling this one for_loops for reasons that should be relatively self-evident. And so we're gonna, like I said, we have to create a list before we can really use a for loop or another collection object. So we'll start out with a list, which we just introduced in the last video. And we're gonna do a list of names again. And I have to separate them with a comma and remember to enclose each individual item in the list in quotes, which I'm already doing a bad job of. There we go. And let's say I want to say hello to all of the people in my list of names. I could do that using a for loop, and it is pretty easy to write. So it's going to look something like this: for name in list of names, print hello, and I'm going to use string concatenation here, and they're already strings, so I don't need to cast them. And then I'm going to put an exclamation point. And so let me show you what this is going to do when I run it. It's going to say hello Alice, hello Bob, hello Charles. And what's happening is this variable here is called my iterator variable. And this is the list I'm iterating through. And so the for loop is going to run exactly as many times as I have elements in my list. And this variable name is going to have the value of the individual element in the list each time I run through. So the first time, and the way the syntax here for the for loop is very similar to while and if statements. It has a structured beginning, it's got a colon, and then everything inside of the for loop is tabbed. So there's no like truth condition here, but it executes however many times we've got items in our referenced lists here, and the iterator variable, each loop, is going to have a different value based off of what we've got in our list. So we can also track how many times we've been in a for loop. So I could say number of times looped, which is something we've had before, equals 0. And every time I hit it, I'm going to say times looped plus equals 1, which increments it by 1. And then I'm also going to print out how many times I've looped. I'm going to use concatenation here, and I have to cast it to a string. And this is just to show you that I can count how many times I'm going through the loop, even though the loop itself does not have anything to do with numbers. The loop is just going for each item in my list of names. So it's going to say hello Alice, tell me it's looped 1 time, hello Bob, looped 2 times, hello Charles, looped 3 times. That's pretty straightforward. Now the power of a for loop is I could have 100 student names in here. I'm not going to type out 100, but so I can add as many names as I want to my list of names, and this loop is going to automatically run on each one of them. And you can see how this would be very powerful if you've got a collection of objects and you need to go through each object and check it for something or do something to it or something like that. So we can also do this with strings. You know, we talked last time about how strings work like lists in Python. So I could also have a string that where I say long sentence is equal to, this is really, 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 really excessively too long sentence. We should put a period at the end of our sentence. And I could loop through my sentence. So instead of looping through my list of names, I'm going to delete this and I'm going to say for letter in long sentence. And we're going to print the letter out. So what do you think is going to happen when I run this? Imagine in your head what you're going to see. Then I'm going to hit play. And you'll notice it is printing out every single letter because the letters are the individual elements in the sentence as I go through it. So let's say we wanted to count how many letters are in the sentence. Going to start at 0. Every time we loop, we're going to say letters in sentence plus equals 1. And then at the end of the loop, we're going to print our long sentence had. And we're going to concatenate. We're going to cast to a string. Going to concatenate again. And finish up and let it run. So 89 letters. Would have taken me a lot longer to count the individual letters in that sentence than it would have to write the program to print them out. And we could also do stuff to the letters in the sentence. So let's say we want to figure out if the sentence has any Q's in it. So we could say the letter we are looking for is Q. And each of the individual letters is going to be a string. It's going to be a string with one element. So I can count my letters, but as I'm counting my letters, I could say, and let's say if we need a little variable to track if we found a Q. We're going to set it to false. False is a variable type. We haven't really talked about it much. It's a Boolean. A Boolean is not super interesting. It is very useful. A Boolean is a variable that can only have a value of true or false. So found Q is going to be a variable of type Boolean. So I've got a couple of things set up here, and I'm going to go ahead and get rid of my list of names because they're just cluttering up my interface here. So I've got my long sentence, and I've got a letter I'm looking for, and I'm going to loop through and see if I find a Q. So I can say if letter, which is going to be every letter in the sentence one by one, is equal to the letter I'm looking for, then I will say found Q equals true. So, and then I can also say, okay, did I have a Q in there? So if found Q, print we found a Q. Else, which should be something you're familiar with, print no Q found. We're very excited about that. So I'm going to run this. It is going to go through all the stuff I already told it to do. It's going to go through every letter in it. It's going to count it. It's going to print it out. And then it's going to tell me at the end if it found a Q. And there's obviously no Q in here. But let's say I had made a typo. I'm going to stick a Q in there. I'm going to run it. And it's going to say it found a Q. It's also going to tell me I have 90 letters in it because I added one more. So let's say we're iterating through a really, really, really big list, right? Thousands and thousands or even millions of elements. And we want to see if we have a Q in there. But when we find a Q, we want to stop. We don't want to go through every individual letter in there. We want to stop as soon as we find a Q. There's actually a way to do that. So the first thing I'll say is that is going to break our counting here, right? If we stop when we find a Q, we are not anymore going to know how many letters are in our sentence. So we can call this letters until Q. So I got to change that. You'll notice it's complaining at me. But this is no longer true. It's not, oh, it's letters until Q. That's why it's complaining at me. Because if we're going to bail as soon as we find that Q, we're no longer counting total letters. We're going to say letters in it before the Q. And in order to make the before true, I have to move this to the end because when we find the Q, we're going to bail out of this loop. So the way you bail out of a loop is to say break. Break will leave the current loop that you were in. So when I run this, what's going to happen? I'll walk you through this program one by one. Setting times loop to 0, that's a new variable. I'm initializing it to 0. I am initializing a new variable called long sentence and setting it equal to this really, really long sentence that has our little Q typo in the middle. I'm also setting a variable called letters until Q equal to 0. I'm saying the letter I'm looking for is Q. So obviously this variable name would not make sense unless we're looking for a Q. And then I've got a little flag to let me know if I found a Q or not. So then I'm saying for letter in long sentence, and this loop is going to run once for each letter in the sentence, And in each loop, the variable called letter is going to have the value of the individual letter we are inspecting. So every time we have our new letter, I'm going to see if that letter is the letter we're looking for. If it is, which is a Q in this case, I'm going to set my found Q to true, and I'm going to break out of the loop. If it's not, I'm going to increment my variable by 1, my counter variable, and I'm going to print my letter out. One question I have here, think about this. Do I ever use times looped? No, I don't. This is left over from an earlier iteration of code, so I'm going to delete it. I don't need it. So when I run this, it is going to go through until it finds a Q. It is going to break if it does. It's going to tell me how many letters it had in it before the Q, and then it is going to tell me that it found a Q because we know there's a Q in there. So I'm going to run it. 26 letters before the Q, and you'll notice it's just printing out the letters before the Q. And it's going to tell me it found it, which we already know because we designed it to, and then it's done. So just to recap, there's one more control flow piece. It's a little bit more complicated, but if I put a command called continue in here, it is going to cause it to reset to the top of the loop. So if I say continue right here, it's not going to exit the loop, but it's going to start over again. So I could use this. Let's say I want to count the number of letters that are not Q. So we are going to call this, we're going to rename our variable again, letters not Q is equal to 0, underscore not underscore Q plus equals 1. So we're going to change this a little bit. Letters in it, that, not Q. Okay, I'm going to run this, and it is going to probably spit out, our sentence has 89 letters, plus we added the Q, so it's 90. So it is counting every letter except the Q. And the way this is working is for every letter, if it is a Q, number one, we're going to set the Q flag true. And then we are going to continue back to the beginning of the loop before we increment the value letters not Q. It continues, you're going to use continues less than you will use breaks. Breaks are really, really common because a lot of times you'll need to bail out of a loop when you hit a specific criteria because you're done. Continue is going to let you conditionally skip part of the loop. You could also accomplish, in most cases, you could accomplish the same thing using an if statement. If statements also let you conditionally execute logic. But a continue is a part of advanced control flow that you may end up using at some point in the future. So I want to recap. This was a pretty dense video. I want to go back and recap some of the stuff in here. A for loop is structured like this. It is structured like for our iterator variable in, and then the thing we're iterating through. This variable that you are using for your for loop, the value of that changes every iteration through the loop based on the items in your collection. It could be a list, it could be a string, or it could be another more complicated type of object. This for loop is going to run the same number of times as we have things in our collection. So if I am working with a list, it's going to run for every item on the list. If I'm working with a string, it's going to run for every letter. Actually, I've been saying letter this entire time, but space isn't really a letter, is it? And periods isn't really a letter. So a better word for this would be character. Because if I had a 9 in my string, if I had an emoji, it would count each one of those because it's an item in the string. So it's going to iterate through it for every item in the collection sequentially. And if we want to bail at a certain point, we can say break. Usually that's hidden behind an if statement because if it's not, it's only going to run one time. It's going to break out as soon as it hits that. And if for some reason we want to skip part of the logic, we can select continue. So what I would like for you to do is I would like for you to write a program, and I'm going to write this down on the screen. I think that's a little bit easier for some people. It's a little bit easier for me too. Write a program that does the following. Prompt the user for a sentence and input it into a variable. Prompt the user for a single letter. Use a for loop to iterate through the user's sentence. Print the number of times that letter appears. So this is going to be some good basic practice on writing a for loop to iterate through a collection, which in this case is not a list, it's a string. And it doesn't use the control flow stuff, but that is a little bit more straightforward than the basic concept of a loop. And we'll be using the control flow stuff later, the break and the continue. So to recap, this is how for loops work in Python. They iterate over collections. You can break out of them. You can also break out of while loops. You can continue in a for loop. You can also continue in a while loop. And what I would like you to do at the end of this video is write a program that does the following. Prompts the user for a sentence, prompts the user for a single letter, uses a for loop to iterate through the user's sentence, calculate the number of times the letter appears, and print out the number of times that letter appears. So again, this has been a pretty dense one. If you end up needing a little bit of help writing your for loops, that's totally expected. Just raise your hand. I'll come over and take a look at it. Otherwise, good luck with the skills check for this loop. And when you are done with this, you are ready to move on to the next programming challenge. So good luck, and let me know if you have any questions.